I remained 3 days and nights, as nearly as I could guess, in my hiding place without getting out of it at all, except twice for the purpose of stretching my limbs by standing erect between two crates just opposite the opening. During the whole period I saw nothing of Augustus, but this occasioned me little uneasiness, as I knew the brig was expected to put to sea every hour, and in the bustle he would not easily find opportunities of coming down to me. At length I heard the trap open and shut, and presently he called in a low voice, asking if all was well, and if there was anything I wanted. "Nothing," I replied. "I am as comfortable as can be. When will the brig sail?" "She'll be under way in less than half an hour," he answered. "I came to let you know, and for fear you should be uneasy at my absence. I shall not have a chance of coming down again for some time, perhaps for 3 or 4 days more. All is going on right above board. After I go up and close the trap, do you creep along by the whipcord to where the nail is driven in. You will find my watch there. It may be useful to you, as you have no daylight to keep time by. I suppose you can't tell how long you have been buried. Only 3 days. This is the 20th. I bring the watch to your box, but am afraid of being missed." With this he went up. In about an hour after he had gone, I distinctly felt the brig in motion, and congratulated myself upon having at length fairly commenced a voyage. Satisfied with this idea, I determined to make my mind as easy as possible, and await the course of events until I should be permitted to accept the box for the more roomy, although hardly more comfortable, accommodations of the cabin. My first care was to get the watch. Leaving the taper burning, I groped along in the dark, following the cord through windings innumerable, in some of which I discovered that after toiling a long distance, I was brought back within a foot or two of a former position. At length I reached the nail, and securing the object of my journey, returned with it in safety. I now looked over the books which had been so thoughtfully provided, and selected the expedition of Lewis and Clark to the mouth of the Columbia. With this I amused myself for some time. When growing sleepy, I extinguished the light with great care, and soon fell into a sound slumber. Upon awaking, I felt strangely confused in mind, and some time elapsed before I could bring to recollection all the various circumstances of my situation. By degrees, however, I remembered all. Striking a light, I looked at the watch, but it was run down, and there were consequently no means of determining how long I had slept. My limbs were greatly cramped, and I was forced to relieve them by standing between the crates. Presently, feeling an almost ravenous appetite, I bethought myself of the cold mutton, some of which I had eaten just before going to sleep and found excellent. What was my astonishment at discovering it to be in a state of absolute putrefaction. The circumstance occasioned me great disquietude, for connecting it with the disorder of mind I experienced upon awaking, I began to suppose that I must have slept for an inordinately long period of time. The close atmosphere of the hold might have had something to do with this, and might in the end be productive of the most serious results. My head ached excessively. I fancied that I drew every breath with difficulty, and in short I was oppressed with a multitude of gloomy feelings. Still I could not venture to make any disturbance by opening the trap or otherwise, and having wound up the watch, contented myself as well as possible. Throughout the whole of the next tedious 24 hours, no person came to my relief, and I could not help accusing Augustus of the grossest inattention. What alarmed me chiefly was that the water in my jug was reduced to about half a pint, and I was suffering much from thirst. Having eaten freely of the bologna sausages after the loss of my mutton, I became very uneasy and could no longer take any interest in my books. I was overpowered, too, with the desire to sleep, yet trembled at the thought of indulging it, lest there might exist some pernicious influence like that of burning charcoal in the confined air of the hold. In the meantime, the roll of the brig told me that we were far in the main ocean, and a dull humming sound, which reached my ears as if from an immense distance, convinced me no ordinary gale was blowing. I could not imagine a reason for the absence of Augustus. We were surely far enough advanced on our voyage to allow of my going up. Some accident might have happened to him, but I could think of none which would account for his suffering, me to remain so long a prisoner, except indeed as having suddenly died or fallen overboard. And upon this idea I could not dwell with any degree of patience. It was possible that we had been baffled by headwinds, and were still in a near vicinity of Nantucket. This notion, however, I was forced to abandon, for such being the case, the brig must have frequently gone about, and I was entirely satisfied from her continual inclination to the larboard, that she had been sailing all along with a steady breeze on her starboard quarter. Besides granting that we were still in the neighborhood of the island, why should not Augustus have visited me and informed me of the circumstance? Pondering in this manner upon the difficulties of my solitary and cheerless condition, I resolved to wait yet another 24 hours, when if no relief were obtained, I would make my way to the trap, and endeavored either to hold a parley with my friend, or get at least a little fresh air through the opening, and a further supply of water from his stateroom. While occupied with this thought, however, I fell, in spite of every exertion to the contrary, into a state of profound sleep, or rather stupor. My dreams were of the most terrific description. Every species of calamity and horror befell me. Among other miseries, I was smothered to death between huge pillows by demons of the most ghastly and ferocious aspect. Immense serpents held me in their embrace, and looked earnestly in my face with their fearfully shining eyes. Then deserts, limitless, and of the most forlorn and awe-inspiring character, spread themselves out before me. Immensely tall trunks of trees, gray and leafless, rose up in endless succession as far as the eye could reach. Their roots were concealed in wide-spreading morasses, whose dreary water lay intensely black, still and altogether terrible beneath, and the strange trees seemed endowed with a human vitality, and waving to and fro, their skeleton arms were crying to the silent waters for mercy, in the shrill and piercing accents of the most acute agony and despair. The scene changed, and I stood naked and alone amid the burning sand plains of Sahara. At my feet lay crouched a fierce lion of the tropics. Suddenly his wild eyes opened and fell upon me. With a convulsive bound he sprang to his feet, and laid bare his horrible teeth. In another instant there burst from his red throat a roar like the thunder of the firmament, and I fell impetuously to the earth. Stifling in a paroxysm of terror, I at last found myself partially awake. My dream then was not all a dream. Now at least I was in possession of my senses. The paws of some huge and real monster were pressing heavily upon my bosom. His hot breath was in my car, and his white and ghastly fangs were gleaming on me through the gloom. Had 1,000 lives hung upon the movement of a limb or the utterance of a syllable, I could have neither stirred nor spoken. The beast, whatever it was, retained his position without attempting any immediate violence, while I lay in an utterly helpless, and I fancied a dying condition beneath him. I felt that my powers of body and mind were fast leaving me. In a word, that I was perishing, and perishing of sheer fright. My brain swam, I grew deadly sick, and vision failed. Even the glaring eyeballs above me grew dim. Making a last strong effort, I at length breathed a faint ejaculation to God, and resigned myself to die. The sound of my voice seemed to arouse all the latent fury of the animal. He precipitated himself at full length upon my body. But what was my astonishment when, with a long, low whine, he commenced licking my face and hands with the greatest eagerness, and with the most extravagant demonstrations of affection and joy. I was bewildered, utterly lost in amazement, but I could not forget the peculiar whine of my Newfoundland dog Tiger, and the odd manner of his caresses I well knew. It was he I experienced a sudden rush of blood to my temples, a giddy and overpowering sense of deliverance and reanimation. I rose hurriedly from the mattress upon which I had been lying, and throwing myself upon the neck of my faithful follower and friend, relieved the long oppression of my bosom in a flood of the most passionate tears. As upon a former occasion, my conceptions were in a state of the greatest indistinctness and confusion. After leaving the mattress, for a long time I found it nearly impossible to connect any ideas, but by very slow degrees my thinking faculties returned, and I again called to memory the several incidents of my condition. For the presence of Tiger I tried in vain to account, and after busying myself with 1,000 different conjectures respecting him, was forced to content myself with rejoicing that he was with me to share my dreary solitude, and render me comfort by his caresses. Most people love their dogs, but for Tiger I had an affection far more ardent than common, and never certainly did any creature more truly deserve it. For 7 years he had been my inseparable companion, and in a multitude of instances had given evidence of all the noble qualities for which we value the animal. I had rescued him when a puppy from the clutches of a malignant little villain in Nantucket, who was leading him with a rope around his neck to the water, and the grown dog repaid the obligation about 3 years afterward by saving me from the bludgeon of a street robber. Getting now hold of the watch, I found upon applying it to my ear that it had again run down. But at this I was not at all surprised, being convinced from the peculiar state of my feelings that I had slept as before for a very long period of time. How long it was, of course, impossible to say. I was burning up with fever, and my thirst was almost intolerable. I felt about the box for my little remaining supply of water, for I had no light, the taper having burnt to the socket of the lantern, and the phosphorus box not coming readily to hand. Upon finding the jug, however, I discovered it to be empty, Tiger no doubt having been tempted to drink it, as well as to devour the remnant of mutton, the bone of which lay well picked by the opening of the box. The spoiled meat I could well spare, but my heart sank as I thought of the water. I was feeble in the extreme, so much so that I shook all over, as with an ague, at the slightest movement or exertion. To add to my troubles, the brig was pitching and rolling with great violence, and the oil casks which lay upon my box were in momentary danger of falling down, so as to block up the only way of ingress or egress. I felt also terrible sufferings from seasickness. These considerations determined me to make my way, at all hazards, to the trap, and obtain immediate relief. Before I could be incapacitated from doing so altogether, having come to this resolve, I again felt about for the phosphorus box and tapers. The form I found after some little trouble, but not after discovering the tapers as soon as I had expected, for I remembered very nearly the spot in which I had placed them. I gave up the search for the present, and bidding Tiger lie quiet, began at once my journey toward the trap. In this attempt my great feebleness became more than ever apparent. It was with the utmost difficulty I could crawl along at all, and very frequently my limbs sank suddenly from beneath me. When falling prostrate on my face, I would remain for some minutes in a state bordering on insensibility. Still I struggled forward by slow degrees, dreading every moment that I should swoon amid the narrow and intricate windings of the lumber, in which event I had nothing but death to expect as the result. At length, upon making a push forward with all the energy I could command, I struck my forehead violently against the sharp corner of an iron-bound crate. The accident only stunned me for a few moments, but I found, to my inexpressible grief, that the quick and violent roll of the vessel had thrown the crate entirely across my path, so as effectually to block up the passage. With my utmost exertions, I could not move it a single inch from its position, it being closely wedged in among the surrounding boxes and ship furniture. It became necessary, therefore, enfeebled as I was, either to leave the guidance of the whipcord and seek out a new passage, or to climb over the obstacle and resume the path on the other side. The former alternative presented too many difficulties and dangers to be thought of without a shudder. In my present weak state of both mind and body, I should infallibly lose my way if I attempted it, and perish miserably amid the dismal and disgusting labyrinths of the hold. I proceeded, therefore, without hesitation, to summon up all my remaining strength and fortitude, and endeavor as I best might to clamber over the crate. Upon standing erect with this end in view, I found the undertaking even more serious task than my fears had led me to imagine. On each side of the narrow passage arose a complete wall of various heavy lumber, which the least blunder on my part might be the means of bringing down upon my head. Or if this accident did not occur, the path might be effectually blocked up against my return by the descending mass, as it was in front by the obstacle there. The crate itself was a long and unwieldy box upon which no foothold could be obtained. In vain I attempted by every means in my power to reach the top, with the hope of being thus enabled to draw myself up. Had I succeeded in reaching it, it is certain that my strength would have proved utterly inadequate to the task of getting over, and it was better in every respect that I failed, at length in a desperate effort to force the crate from its ground. I felt a strong vibration in the side next me. I thrust my hand eagerly to the edge of the planks, and found that a very large one was loose. With my pocket knife, which luckily I had with me, I succeeded after great labor in prying it entirely off, and getting through the aperture discovered to my exceeding joy that there were no boards on the opposite side. In other words, that the top was wanting, it being the bottom through which I had forced my way. I now met with no important difficulty in proceeding along the line until I finally reached the nail. With a beating heart I stood erect, and with a gentle touch pressed against the cover of the trap. It did not rise as soon as I had expected, and I pressed it with somewhat more determination, still dreading lest some other person than Augustus might be in his stateroom. The door, however, to my astonishment, remained steady, and I became somewhat uneasy, for I knew that it had formerly required little or no effort to remove. I pushed it strongly. It was nevertheless firm with all my strength. It still did not give way. With rage, with fury, despair, it set at defiance my utmost efforts, and it was evident from the unyielding nature of the resistance that the whole had either been discovered and effectually nailed up, or that some immense weight had been placed upon it which it was useless to think of removing. My sensations were those of extreme horror and dismay. In vain I attempted to reason on the probable cause of my being thus entombed. I could summon up no connected chain of reflection, and sinking on the floor gave way unresistingly to the most gloomy imaginings, in which the dreadful deaths of thirst, famine, suffocation, and premature interment crowded upon me as the prominent disasters to be encountered. At length there returned to me some portion of presence of mind. I arose and felt with my fingers for the seams or cracks of the aperture. Having found them, I examined them closely to ascertain if they emitted any light from the stateroom, but none was visible. I then forced the pin blade of my knife through them until I met with some hard obstacle scraping against it. I discovered to be a solid mass of iron, which from its peculiar wavy feel, as I passed the blade along it, I concluded to be a chain cable. The only course now left me was to retrace my way to the box, and there either yield to my sad fate or try to tranquilize my mind as to admit of my arranging some plan of escape. I immediately set about the attempt and succeeded after innumerable difficulties in getting back. As I sank utterly exhausted upon the mattress, Tiger threw himself at full length by my side, and seemed as if desirous by his caresses of consoling me in my troubles and urging me to bear them with fortitude. The singularity of his behavior at length forcibly arrested my attention. After licking my face and hands for some minutes, he would suddenly cease doing so and utter a low whine. Upon reaching out my hand towards him, I then invariably found him lying on his back with his paws uplifted. His conduct, so frequently repeated, appeared strange, and I could in no manner account for it. As the dog seemed distressed, I concluded that he had received some injury, and taking his paws in my hands, I examined them one by one, but found no sign of any hurt. I then supposed him hungry, and gave him a large piece of ham, which he devoured with avidity. Afterward, however, resuming his extraordinary maneuvers, I now imagined that he was suffering, like myself, the torments of thirst, and was about adopting this conclusion as the true one, when the idea occurred to me that I had yet only examined his paws, and that there might possibly be a wound upon some portion of his body or head. The latter I felt carefully over, but found nothing. On passing my hand, however, along his back, I perceived a slight erection of his hair extending completely across it. Probing with my finger, I discovered a string, and tracing it up, found that it encircled the whole body. Upon a closer examination, I came across a small slip of what had the feeling of letter paper, through which the string had been fastened in such a manner as to bring it immediately beneath the left shoulder of the animal.